December 8, 1983, Carnegie Hall, New York City. A charity gala filled with America's most prestigious names, socialites, philanthropists, classical music legends, and one rock star who was about to face the most humiliating moment of his career. But when 71-year-old Professor Vincent Ashford looked directly at Freddie Mercury and issued a challenge designed to destroy him, nobody in that room knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. Because Freddie Mercury had been hiding a secret that would leave every classical music snob speechless and prove once and for all that true talent transcends every boundary we try to build around it. The exhaustion was killing him, not the kind of tiredness you feel after a long tour or a difficult recording session. This was something deeper, more frightening. For the past year, Freddie Mercury had been fighting a private battle that nobody knew about, a health challenge that drained his energy, tested his spirit, and forced him to dig deeper than he ever thought possible. He hadn't told the band. He hadn't told his closest friends. Only his doctor and one trusted confidant knew the truth, and Freddie was determined to keep it that way because he refused to be defined by illness. That December evening, as Freddie's limousine pulled up to Carnegie Hall, he almost told his driver to turn around. The charity gala invitation had arrived weeks earlier, supporting music education for underprivileged children. His instinct was to decline. He wasn't feeling well, didn't have the energy for formal events and small talk with people who looked down on rock musicians, but something made him reconsider. The cause mattered to him. Music education had changed his own life at St. Peter's School in India, where classical training opened doors he didn't know existed. Walking into that prestigious hall, Freddie noticed the glances immediately, the whispered comments. He was used to being stared at, but this was different. These weren't fans. These were people who saw him as an intruder, an imposter at their exclusive event. He caught fragments of conversation that cut deeper than any critic's review. What is he doing here? I suppose they'll let anyone in these days. But there was one person in that room whose hatred for Freddie Mercury went beyond mere musical snobbery. Professor Vincent Ashford came from old Boston money, Harvard-educated, had studied under the greatest piano masters in Vienna. His career spanned 5 decades of impeccable classical performance. He believed with every fiber of his being that classical music was the only true music. Everything else was noise, particularly rock and roll, which he called barbaric and simplistic. In 1975, when Bohemian Rhapsody took the world by storm, Professor Ashford had written a scathing editorial in the New York Times, calling it an abomination and a classical music imitation performed by amateurs who didn't understand what they were attempting. When someone pointed out that Freddie Mercury had classical piano training, Professor Ashford dismissed it. Training doesn't equal talent. Any fool can learn scales. True musicianship is in the blood. But there was another, more personal reason for Professor Ashford's hatred. In 1979, his nephew, a promising young pianist, had abandoned classical music, given up a potential career at Juilliard. Why? Because he discovered Queen. Because he wanted to be like Freddie Mercury. Professor Ashford never forgave this betrayal, never forgave the man he blamed for corrupting his nephew and destroying classical music's future. The gala began with cocktails and uncomfortable small talk. Freddie, fighting waves of exhaustion that nobody could see, tried to engage politely with the other guests. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his famous mustache groomed to perfection. To anyone watching, he looked like the confident rock star they expected. But inside, he was battling something that terrified him more than any hostile audience ever could. Have you ever been in a room where you felt like you didn't belong? Where people judge you before knowing your story? Freddie had dealt with this his entire life, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of his secret illness made every whispered insult feel heavier, every condescending glance more pointed. The formal program began with classical performances, string quartets, solo piano pieces, everything elegant and refined. Freddie watched appreciatively, genuinely loving the music despite what people assumed about rock stars. Classical music had been his first musical language, the foundation everything else was built upon. But as the evening progressed, he could feel Professor Ashford's eyes on him, could sense something brewing. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, Professor Vincent Ashford took the stage. The audience hushed with reverence. This was the highlight they'd been waiting for. Professor Ashford sat at the grand piano and played Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor with flawless technique and nuanced interpretation. When he finished, the applause was thunderous, a standing ovation for classical music's royalty at its finest. But instead of leaving the stage gracefully, Professor Ashford walked to the microphone. The room quieted, expecting a gracious thank you. What they got was something very different, something that would change the course of the entire evening. Professor Ashford looked directly at Freddie, making sure everyone saw where his attention was focused, then spoke with a smile that carried poison. "Ladies and gentlemen, I see we have a celebrity in our midst tonight. Mr. Mercury, isn't it? From that rock group?" His tone was condescending, the word rock delivered like an insult. Freddie nodded politely but didn't respond, sensing the trap being set. Professor Ashford continued, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "I must confess, I've always been curious about rock musicians. So much noise, so much spectacle. But where is the musicianship? Where is the technique?" The room tittered with uncomfortable laughter as the aristocratic audience began to understand what was happening. Then came the moment that was designed to destroy Freddie Mercury's dignity. "Perhaps, Mr. Mercury, you'd like to demonstrate for us what rock musicians consider music. Show us your talents." The invitation sounded almost friendly if you didn't hear the mockery beneath it. The room fell silent, every eye turning to Freddie, waiting for his response. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others amused, all waiting to see what would happen next. Freddie stood up slowly, started to speak, but Professor Ashford wasn't finished with his humiliation. "Oh my," Professor Ashford said with theatrical concern. "You've gone quite pale, Mr. Mercury. Are you feeling unwell? I hope our classical music hasn't been too overwhelming for your rock and roll sensibilities." That comment hit Freddie harder than anyone in that room could know because he was unwell, had been unwell for a year. The exhaustion of hiding it, of pretending to be strong when his body was failing, suddenly felt crushing. The accusation of looking pale, of looking weak, touched the very fear he'd been fighting to conceal. For just a moment, Freddie froze, just long enough for Professor Ashford to smile triumphantly. To think he'd won, to believe he'd exposed the rock star as the fraud he always claimed him to be. The room watched, some uncomfortable, some amused, all waiting to see if the king of Queen would crumble under the weight of classical music's judgment. And that's when something extraordinary happened. From the back of the room, a young voice cut through the silence, clear and strong and absolutely unafraid. "Excuse me, Professor Ashford." Everyone turned. A young woman was standing up, maybe 19 years old, dark hair pulled back in an elegant bun, Juilliard school blazer visible beneath her evening dress. She was clearly a music student, someone's guest at the gala, and she was doing something nobody else in that room had the courage to do. She was challenging Professor Vincent Ashford. The young woman's voice didn't waver as she addressed the classical music legend. "Professor Ashford, you've just played Chopin beautifully, but Chopin himself was considered vulgar by some classical purists of his time. Too emotional, too popular. They said he was destroying the purity of piano music." Professor Ashford's face reddened. "Young lady, that's hardly the same thing." But the 19-year-old student, Sarah Chen, continued without allowing herself to be silenced. "Music isn't about genre superiority, Professor Ashford. It's about touching hearts. Chopin touched hearts. Mr. Mercury touches hearts. That's what makes them both artists. What you just did wasn't protecting classical music. It was bullying, and that has nothing to do with music at all." The room gasped. A 19-year-old student had just publicly corrected one of classical music's most revered figures. Professor Ashford sputtered, trying to regain control, but he'd lost the moment. "And in that case, us," with a young woman's courage echoing through Carnegie Hall, Freddie Mercury did something nobody expected. He began walking toward the stage. Not angry, not defensive, just calm and determined, every step deliberate. The room watched in stunned silence as the man they'd just seen humiliated approached the very piano where Professor Ashford had performed his flawless Chopin. Professor Ashford backed away from the piano as Freddie approached, suddenly uncertain about what he'd unleashed. Freddie reached the grand piano, the same instrument that had been touched by classical legends for over a century, and ran his fingers lightly across the keys. He looked out at the audience of socialites and philanthropists and music snobs and spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice was soft but carried perfectly in the hushed hall. Professor Ashford is right about one thing. Actions speak louder than words. Then Freddie Mercury sat down at the grand piano. What happened next shocked every single person in that prestigious room. The first notes that came from the piano weren't rock music. They weren't Queen songs. They were Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Freddie played the solo piano part with an authority and emotion that silenced every doubt, every sneer, every assumption in that room. His fingers danced across the keys with a precision that came from years of training, from countless hours of practice that the world never saw. Because the world only saw Freddie Mercury, the rock star. They didn't see the boy who had studied classical piano at St. Peter's School in India, who had practiced Chopin and Bach while his classmates played cricket, who had learned musical theory before he learned to drive, who had never stopped loving classical music even as he conquered rock and roll. The room was frozen. Professor Ashford's face had gone from red to white as he watched something he believed impossible. A rock musician playing Rachmaninoff with genuine skill and genuine emotion. Not perfectly, perhaps. There were small imperfections that a trained ear might catch, but the feeling, the passion, the understanding of the music's emotional architecture was undeniable. Freddie played for nearly 8 minutes. The room didn't breathe, didn't move, just watched and listened as every assumption they held about rock musicians crumbled with each passing phrase. The same hands that had created We Will Rock You and Somebody to Love were now bringing Rachmaninoff to life with a sensitivity that would have impressed the composer himself. When he finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then something remarkable happened. The first person to stand and applaud was a woman in the front row wearing the insignia of the Manhattan Conservatory of Music, one of classical music's gatekeepers, and she was giving Freddie Mercury a standing ovation. Others followed. One by one, then in waves, the audience rose. Even people who had been laughing at Professor Ashford's mockery minutes earlier were now applauding Freddie with genuine respect and amazement. The sound built until it filled the entire Carnegie Hall with appreciation for a performance nobody had expected and everyone would remember. Freddie stood and bowed simply. No rock star flourishes, no theatrical gestures, just a humble acknowledgement of the applause. Then he looked directly at the 19-year-old student still standing in the back of the room. Their eyes met, and Freddie nodded a small gesture but meaningful, an acknowledgement of her courage, a thank you for speaking when no one else would. Professor Vincent Ashford had slipped away during the applause, disappearing to some corner where he didn't have to face the moment he had created and completely lost control of. His plan for humiliation had become his own humiliation instead. After the performance, Freddie asked to meet Sarah Chen, the young woman who had defended him. She was 19 years old, a student at Juilliard's piano program. Her professor said she had promise but lacked confidence, always second-guessing herself, freezing during performances. That night was the first time she had spoken without hesitation in a room full of adults, and it had been to defend a rock star she'd never met against a classical legend who terrified her. Freddie and Sarah talked for nearly an hour that night. He asked about her studies, her dreams, her fears. She admitted she loved classical music but also loved Queen, listened to Bohemian Rhapsody before auditions because it calmed her nerves, but had never told anyone because she thought it would make her less serious as a classical musician. Freddie laughed warmly. Darling, music is music. The categories are just marketing. What matters is whether it moves you, whether it makes you feel something. Never be ashamed of what moves you. Before the night ended, Freddie did something that would change Sarah's life forever. He offered to help pay for her continued education at Juilliard anonymously through a trust that wouldn't be connected to his name. He didn't want credit, didn't want attention, just wanted to help a talented young woman who had reminded him on a night when he felt most vulnerable that courage comes in all forms. Sarah would never know the full extent of Freddie's generosity until years after his death. When the trust documents were finally revealed, she discovered that Freddie had not only funded her education, but had created a scholarship in her name for other young musicians from working-class backgrounds. The young woman who defended him in 1983 would go on to help hundreds of other young musicians access opportunities they couldn't otherwise afford. The story of that December night spread through musical circles quietly. No newspapers covered it, no cameras recorded it, but musicians talked, whispered about the night Professor Vincent Ashford tried to humiliate Freddie Mercury and was silenced by Rachmaninoff. Professor Vincent Ashford retired from public performance within 2 years of that night. He never publicly spoke about Freddie Mercury again. When he died in 1990, just months before Freddie himself passed away, some noted the strange coincidence of both men departing the world within the same year. But the real legacy of that night wasn't about Professor Ashford or his failure. Sarah Chen graduated from Juilliard with honors, became a respected piano professor, and founded a music education program for underprivileged children, inspired by the very charity that had brought Freddie to that gala in the first place. She told the story of that December night to every student who doubted themselves, told them about a rock star who knew Rachmaninoff and a young woman who found her voice defending someone she'd never met. And she never forgot what Freddie whispered to her before they parted that night. The people who try to make you feel small are always smaller themselves. Never let anyone silence your voice, darling. It's the only instrument that's truly yours. There was something else about that night, something Freddie never told anyone. When Professor Ashford mocked him for looking pale, for looking unwell, Freddie felt something break inside. Not because of the insult, but because of the truth accidentally touched. He was unwell, had been for a year, would continue to be for the rest of his life. Standing in that room being mocked for a weakness he was desperately trying to hide, Freddie made a decision that would define his remaining years. He would never let illness define him, would never give anyone ammunition to pity him or dismiss him, would continue performing, creating, living at full intensity until his body absolutely refused to continue. That night at Carnegie Hall wasn't just about defending rock music's legitimacy. It was about Freddie proving to himself that he was still Freddie Mercury, still powerful, still capable of silencing doubters with talent instead of words. For 8 years after that December night, he kept his secret, performed at Live Aid, recorded A Kind of Magic, created The Miracle, and Innuendo, did press interviews and photo shoots and everything expected of a global rock star. And nobody knew, nobody suspected, because Freddie Mercury refused to be defined by anything except his art. That December night in 1983 was a turning point, a moment when Freddie could have crumbled under the weight of illness and insult. Instead, he walked to a piano and reminded the world and himself who he really was. Not a rock star, not a classical musician, just a musician, pure and simple. Sarah Chen still teaches piano in New York City today. On the wall of her studio hangs a photograph of Freddie Mercury at a piano, listening to Sarah speak her truth to power. The irony has never been lost on those who know the full story. Professor Vincent Ashford spent his entire career guarding the gates of classical music, deciding who belonged and who didn't. In one evening, his worldview was dismantled by a rock star and a teenage music student. Freddie Mercury walked into that room expecting nothing but an uncomfortable evening supporting a good cause. He walked out having changed a young woman's life and proven once again that he was always more than any single label could contain.